Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. My name is Mark, and today I'm going to show you how I built my new Outfeed Table out of a Craig Universal Workbench. This one has the dog holes in the top, and I went that route because of all of Craig's dog hole tools. I wanted to be able to use those with my new Outfeed Table, my new flat workbench surface. All of those tools I'm going to keep stored in this compartment in the top, and underneath we have a couple of big drawers that I haven't even started loading up yet. I'm gonna grow into that. And then I have one big cupboard door that has a slide at the bottom for some bigger, heavier tools. That one's not necessarily heavy, but this one certainly is. And that helps me get it out of the way when I'm not gonna use it very often, but easy to get at when I do need it. So anyway, this is the project for today. Let's get to it. Before we get into the build, let me show you what we are replacing. This is my old Outfeed Table. This is a Rockler material handling cart or panel cart or something like that. This actually has hooks and you can pull a pin and it'll tip over, and then you can roll through doorways with full sheets of plywood without actually having to heave them in your arms. And it's a convenient tool that I built into my Outfeed Table. And it's worked for a long time. In fact, I've got a video about building this if you want to check that out and just kind of see where this started. But having used it for years now, I've found some things I don't like about it, and it's time to remedy that. Number one, because of the frame and the box is designed around still being able to tip it, even though I have not moved it from my table saw since I built it. So the design of it doesn't function for what it's kind of like permanently meant for. The other problem is all of the open spaces, just open shelves, even open cavities into the drawers. There are cubbies in the back, which are handy, but again, they're only there because this is designed to tip down. If it weren't for that feature still being in it, I would have this be big and squared off and more storage. But all of these open cavities lend themselves to collecting dust. Even with good dust collection on a saw, dust comes off of the saw this way over time, and it just ends up in and around everywhere. So it works. I can improve on it. The number one reason I would like to replace this is the T-track top. Now, I don't mind T-track at all. It has its place. I like it a lot for certain things, but for my Outfeed Table, it's got a pretty serious flaw, and here's what that is. Imagine whatever you're running through here might have a bow, or who knows what's going on with it. If you run across this and you have it perfect, yep, it might slide. But if the front end dives down at all, you can run into those perpendicular tracks and it might stop your progress. So if you're not paying attention, the piece could stop and your hands could keep going. You might just hit it, cause a burn, might hit it, tweak sideways, cause a kickback. I've never had anything bad happen, but I have hit that a few times and it stops me. I don't want to do that anymore. So we're going to replace all of that with a little bit bigger surface with dog holes. So it's going to function with hold down and stopping a lot like the T-track. But with the dog holes, there's not going to be anything for me to catch when I'm feeding material through this. So this is where we started. Now let's get to the new nice stuff.
To begin, I had to assemble the Craig Universal Bench, which starts with the legs. I attached the adjustable lower leg to the main leg with 2 bolts from each side. I did this with all 4 legs, then tightened the hardware, making sure to keep them all the same length. To figure out that length, I knew the dog hole top is 1.5 inches thick, and I wanted about a 1/2 inch of leeway to accommodate for my wonky floors with the adjustable feet. So I knew the legs needed to be about 2 inches shorter than my table saw. Now here comes the complicated part. I have another one of these benches in use as my CNC table. If you look at the lower shelf, this is the lowest it can be mounted because of the adjustable legs. Now this works out great when you plan to use the floor for storage underneath, but for this build I want to get my enclosed storage as close to the ground as possible, which means I'm going to have to make some modifications to the frame. I put the rails in place in the legs and marked out some new hole locations as close to the bottom as possible. Then at the drill press, using a scrap of wood with a dado in it to capture the bolt heads, I drilled holes in my new locations. To assemble the lower rails, the hardware had to come from the inside out. Otherwise, they would interfere with the adjustable feet. It took all of my dexterity to hold the bolts in from the bottom and fit it together before putting the nuts on the outside. For the bottommost bolt, I added a washer with a section cut off of it to help keep things square, since the flange nut was going to overlap the leg section just a bit. There's one last little detail to point out. Dropping the lower rails to the bottom like this covers up the hole for the foot, so I need to cut out a small notch in each rail to allow the foot to pass through. With each pair of legs assembled, I clamped them upright to my bench so I didn't have to keep fighting gravity with the little bolts, and I installed the long rails to the legs. Up until now, all the hardware is only finger tight to make it easier to assemble, but once the last rails are in place, I make sure to fully tighten every bolt. It's important to get them really good and tight now, because once the cabinet portion is built, I'll never have access to this hardware again.
All right, guys, I've got the frame together, and even with my complicating it, it went together well, and it went together square. So it bolted up nice, it's really strong. It's time to start cutting the cabinet parts into place. Now, when I finished this, I ran to the store in town and I took a look at all the different plywood that they have, and I panicked and had a heart attack. And then when I got done foaming at the mouth, I decided to pick about a $65 sheet of plywood instead of the $100 sheet of plywood next to it. This is big box store stuff. It is not even high quality necessarily. And those numbers still just made me kind of panic. Anyway, got home, started cutting that stuff up. And real quick, let me show you what we have going on. This is some birch plywood, and I was actually pretty happy to see how many layers there are. It's very flat, it's very nice. It looked like it was high quality stuff, but as soon as I started cutting it, I was getting some edge splintering. So I came back with some painter's tape and put tape right on the edge so that when I did my last cut, I got this nice sharp edge. I learned that. I'm going to run you over to this other board that I worked a little bit further on. I learned that because on this first one, it was pretty rough. And I didn't want that showing, so I thought, okay, I'll fix the other side. And this can just be inside the cabinet and you'll never even see it. Well, I put the tape on it, and we ended up with a pretty nice sharp edge. But this is the worst plywood as far as the veneer goes that I have ever worked with. Because if you look over here, when I pulled the tape off, it pulled the veneer right off. I'm so very disappointed in this. I don't know if I need to go cut another piece and be even more careful with it, if I need to chalk this piece of wood, if you can call it that, up as a loss and go buy the $100 sheet. Either way, that was very disappointing. But we'll move on and I'll show you what we've got going on here. How do you like my armpit? That's got to be all you can see, right? Now that I've dropped the bottom frame all the way down, when I go to adjust the feet and raise it to match the height of my table saw, I'm not going to be able to reach under here to get to that nut. So normally I would have put the bottom in first. That would support everything, and then build the cabinet up from there. But because I can't do that, I'm not putting a bottom in it until the very end. So to do that, part of the problem is there's not going to be a lot of lip left once there's sides and a back and a front on. So there's not much lip for that bottom to sit on. So I put a cross piece in that'll go across the length of this. And then I'm planning on having a single or maybe double doors on the one half, the right half, and then drawers on the left half. There doesn't even need to be a bottom in the drawer side, but on the cabinet side there does. So with this sitting in here, I can put the bottom in after the fact, set it down, and it'll have this extra piece of support back there. Because of the thickness of the metal here, you can't just put this in and have it be the right height. So if we look real close, hopefully this focuses here. I used the saw to make one tiny little kerf, the thickness of that piece of metal. That way this rides inside the rail and this rides flush with the top of the rail. So we're going to put that in there. And there's a screw hole right here to keep it from sliding around. The problem is if I put it here, then the sides are going to sit on top of that screw, and that's not going to work. So I'm actually going to screw this in from the bottom. Not that it needs to be secured to this so much for strength. It needs to just keep from sliding around on me. So put the screw in from the bottom so the screw head isn't on the top. And then we can continue building in the cabinet and crying about our crappy plywood.
I put the back in place to make sure it fit, and if you look closely here, you can see that the panel leans back ever so slightly because of the lower leg section. To To keep things square, I cut a strip of wood the same thickness as the metal and glued it to the outside face of the back panel. Then I reinstalled the back and attached it to the legs.
Let's talk design strategy here for just a second. I put this back in here and it's pretty much flush with the back side, which is great. I'm not going to see the back side. It's going to be up against the table saw. And my original idea was to do that same thing on the sides. But after fighting with this terrible plywood, you can see it's just all chewed up just from existing. Once I kind of had this thing fit together, I decided I didn't like that and I could still use the rotten plywood and do things a little bit differently. And now the reason being, I did that side already to kind of prove my concept, and I might have to move the camera around to show this. But we're going to do door on this side, drawers on this side, and then a hatch up here for the dog hole tools. That we'll get to in a little bit. But in order for the drawers to work, they have to be flush or inset from any sort of legs. So if I were to do flush to the outside like I did with the back, we'll just demonstrate here, that doesn't work. I would have to put blocks in here and space that off of the, what would be the side. I'll demonstrate it this way now. I'd have to space it off of this thing. So I'd put this in and then I'd immediately block it. So I switched to making it flush with the inside edge of this rail. So we did this side already. That went really well. We have bigger holes down here than we need, and I'll show you in just a second how I'm going to hide that by the time we get to the end. So this is the one that I cut originally. I was able to shave off just a little bit. I can hide the imperfections either behind the angle iron or on the inside where it doesn't matter. But in order to get it spaced to where I need it, I made a spacer for the back and for the front. The one for the back is really easy. It's just high enough to sit on top of that extra piece, just like that. And then it is from the back wall to the front edge of that leg. It is that exact thickness, so it's perfect. So this will get butted up against here. That one was easy. This one, a little bit thicker because it's not butting up against anything. It has to go from this face and this face. But because that corner is rounded, I couldn't have a sharp corner. So that's why we beveled that edge just a little bit there. And then this one, same thing, goes in here. This will end up getting fastened through the leg from this side, and then this board will get fastened to both of those spacers from the other side, making it inset in there. And now, bring you around here for just a second. Because that hole is bigger than it needed to be, but it's structurally very, very good, all I'm going to do is come back with some kind of trim piece and attach it, boop, 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 up and all the way around. That will hide everything, be really, really strong, and I'm happier with this design than the one I started with.
The footage you're looking at now is showing you the exact thing I just said I was going to do. I spent a minute or two debating over how to edit this part. Maybe a quick montage set to music, maybe an even quicker sped up footage sequence just to get through it and move on. It obviously doesn't need a voiceover because I already explained what you're seeing. It might be a good opportunity to talk about Craig, the sponsor of this video, but I think I'm going to save that for a little while later when I get into using their awesome pocket hole jig. So I guess in order to fill this time, I'll just read you some of my favorite poems. This one is by...
Huh? What's that? What do you mean? No.
Well, Gary tells me I already filled this time with my rambling, so moving on. For the inside components of the cabinet, which will essentially be a letter T, I used Craig's awesome 720 Pro pocket hole jig to drill a series of holes around some 3/4 inch plywood. I cut the vertical piece to size and a scrap to match and then put them upright on the sides of the cabinet as spacers. Then I tapped the main shelf down into place on top of them. Then with the front edges flush, I attached this shelf to the sides using pocket hole screws.
So we've reached a point where if I add another piece of wood to this, it's going to be too heavy for me to move it around very well by myself. So I got it off of the workbench and down to the floor, and then I put it up on buckets and a platform because it's an awkward height. I didn't want to be all the way on the ground to work with it, so now it's up enough that I can work on it, but low enough that I can get it back on the ground when I'm done with it. Anyway, I've got the thing tipped up on its side, and really quick I want to show you this. Still fighting with this really junky wood. The backboard is bowed, so it's perfect at the corners. You have to imagine going sideways. This is the direction that this thing is going to be standing. So I'm fighting this curve, and I decided this is going to be the easiest way to get all of this put in here. So throw that back in there. I cut these spacers so that they will space the middle block exactly in the center of this. Don't tip over on me. I can throw these in here just like that. And then this board with all the pocket holes already drilled in it goes in there. There. And I'm going to make this corner flush with this because I know this to be the plane that I want it to be in. And once this is screwed into there, and I have one hole here to screw into the bottom so that the bottom doesn't want to kick out, I will actually squeeze from the back side and try to pull that backboard against the back side of this, and then screw those in. That way, I will bring that back panel into flat and flush with the rest of this nonsense. You look perfectly flush at the front, perfectly flush to this piece at the back, and then that's quite the gap all the way along. So we're going to pull this up into this and then tighten down those screws from here and then do it from the top. Keep an eye on that crack right there. There. That's all I needed. I pulled it tight. Now I can start running screws, and each screw I put in here should pull that whole thing further over and tighten it up. Back on solid ground. So we got that fitting pretty tight that my spacers aren't even moving around in there. Look at just how awful this plywood is. That crack actually opened up overnight, over the last day or two. That wasn't separated the last time I held this piece of wood. Jerk. Now, depending on what the game here is, normally it wouldn't really be that fun to look at all of the holes in a work surface, but this is never really going to get seen again. We're going to put dog hole top on top of this. You will not get at it from the top. You'll get at it from the front, and you're never really going to see in there anyway. It's going to be storage for all these dog hole style tools that I'm going to have to use with that. So they'll just slide in the front and sit in there. And over time, this is going to fill with dust because that's just the nature of dog holes. Dust goes down through them. And I think I have a solution for that too.
Now it's time to move on to building the drawers. After cutting all the components to size, there are a ton of different ways you could assemble a drawer body, but I'm sure you could guess that today I'm going to use pocket holes. This technique for making drawers is about the fastest and easiest one I know, and after I attach the drawer fronts a little later on, all the hardware will be completely hidden. And that officially brings us to Kreg Tools, the sponsor of this video. Earlier, I mentioned their 720 Pro pocket hole jig, and I used it to drill a bunch of holes in 3/4 inch material. Well, this has to be the slickest tool I've used for making pocket holes, because now, in order to switch to 1/2 inch material for these drawers, all I have to do is move the collet on the drill bit and I'm off to the races again. Then on the working side, there's just one lever I have to push down and raise up to lock and unlock my material while I'm drilling holes. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this tool for me was the dust collection. I've used other jigs that keep things acceptably tidy when you hook them up to a shop vac, but this tool looks to be 100% effective. There isn't one flake of dust that escapes out of this tool, and when you have a bunch of holes to drill, that can get to be a big mess without good dust collection. Now that all the holes are drilled, I can continue with the super simple drawer construction. Using a little bit of glue, I line up the corners and use a right angle clamp to hold the pieces together while I drive the screws in. Then, I just proceed from one joint to the next until I have a complete rectangle. For the bottoms, I use more glue and a few brad nails while I pull the box square by making the edges all flush with each other. Then I come back and install some recessed screws for a little more strength. 1/2 inch material here is probably overkill since I'm not likely to put that much weight inside these drawers, but since this is the material I had, this is what I went with. To install the drawer slides in the cabinet, I used scrap wood spacers and a scribed line to position the slides up off the bottom. I used a self-centering drill bit for pilot holes, then short screws to secure the slides in place. I matched the slides up on both sides, then stack the spacer on top of the first slide and repeat the process for all 3 pairs. To mount the drawers, I set the bottom one between the slides on top of another spacer to give me a little clearance. Then I pull the slides out flush with the front of the drawer and run in screws working from front to back. To reach the furthest back hole, I have to remove the drawer, run in the screw, then put the drawer back in place. For each additional drawer, I use a spacer resting on top of the drawer below it and repeat the process. I used a shelf pin jig to add a couple of shelf pin holes inside the cabinet space. I'm not sure I will actually ever use the shelf here, but this way I have the option in the future if I need it. To mount the cabinet door, I'm using these swing-out hinges, and it took me a little while to figure out the correct placement for them, so never mind all those other pencil lines and holes you see there. Let's just pretend I got it right on the first try. With this space completely enclosed, there's no way for me to mount the door with the door closed, and I'm not confident that I could get the door lined upright if I attached the hinges in the open position. So my solution was to cut a scrap to the height of the door and mark out the hole locations on it. Then I taped that template I just made to the full door with the edges perfectly in line. I used the drill press to drill holes all the way through the template piece and into the door. When I attached the door using the pre-drilled holes, it fit perfectly. This particular pair of hinges doesn't really have a built-in stop at 90 degrees, so I added one myself on the opposite side of the cabinet. Using more of those hinges, I mounted a board to fill the space between the top rail and the main shelf. This ends up looking like a huge drawer front, but instead it just tips down and gives me access to that whole space. I cut drawer faces to size, then attached them to the drawer bodies using hot glue. I also added temporary drawer pulls made out of duct tape so I can get them back open once these are all in place. I marked a center line on the drawers and used a drawer pull jig to drill correctly spaced holes. I have a box full of miscellaneous drawer pulls, and I managed to find enough matching ones to complete this project. For the door, I installed the pull vertically, and for the tip-down compartment, I favored the top a bit to give me a little more leverage when opening that up. We're in the final stretches now here, folks. I added some pieces of trim to the side to hide that hardware and make things a little prettier. I cleaned up around the old outfeed table and rolled it out of the way, then I had to clean up some more. This is the kind of mess I'm hoping to avoid now with this new cabinet. At this point, this thing has gotten really heavy. I lifted up my platform and kicked the buckets out of the way, then rested it back down on a block of wood so I wouldn't pinch my fingers. Then I went to the backside and dropped it down to the ground. I slid one set of feet onto a rolling dolly, then rolled the whole works into position behind the saw, barely clipping the tripod on my way past.
Careful, 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 careful.
I set the new dog hole top in place, got it in the center, then attached it from underneath with the provided screws. It was all I could do to reach the holes in the back, but with some contorting and angry grunting and a little bit of help from my ladybug friend Pedro, I got the job done. The holes in the front were much easier because the rails have matching holes in the top and bottom, so I could put a bit through the bottom, set the screw on top, then get the drill involved and just push straight up without any pilot holes. I threw a straight edge across the top of the saw, and you can see that the new table is still about a ½ inch low, which is how we planned it. So now, all I have to do is adjust the feet until the surface is just barely below the saw. Then once that's dialed in, I crawl back inside the cabinet and tighten the nuts to keep them from ever moving again.
All right, I've got one step left to do here, and that is to route out a groove for a miter sled to pass through, because I have the outfeed table surface just barely below the table saw surface. If I run that forward, I run into the front face of this, so I need a space for that stem to pass through. Same thing with my other sleds and jigs and stuff. I have to have room for those in there. So in order to do that, I matched the line on this table saw and put that line on the table, and I'm gonna go out about 16 inches. So then I went from the line that I drew to about 3/16 on either side to allow for some slop for that, and I drew another line. And then I clamped these straight edges down to the edge of the table, and up there you can even see, because this piece wasn't long enough, I used the dog hole to hold it down. So it's the bench is now working on itself. But I have a flush trim bit, or template bit, or pattern bit, or whatever the heck you want to call that, that's going to ride along the face of this while it's cutting that groove. And then I have a stop up there, so it's going to bump against that, and we'll come back. And we'll probably do it in 2 passes because I'm going to need to go most of a 1/2 inch deep. And if I go a 1/2 inch deep in 1 pass, that's just too much for that little bit. And then we're going to do this one and then set it up for the second one, and we'll have 2 matching channels cut in here. All right, guys, let's wrap this thing up. I would really like to thank Craig for their support with this video. You know, their pocket hole jig is fantastic. The universal bench system that I built into this is fantastic. Those are the 2 main things that I talked about, but you probably noticed throughout the video there was a lot of blue stuff, a lot of really cool Craig tools that popped up here and there. I'm going to have links to all of that kind of stuff down below because I didn't get time to just specifically talk about all of it. But I did want to show you, I went with the dog hole style top because of all of Craig's bench dog hole style tools. You have these lateral clamps here that you just give a few turns and they let your thing loose. You have these, I think these are bench dogs that you can move around really quick. And then they also have rubber tops. So if you want to put something on top and sand it without it sliding around, it works great for that. You also have these auto adjusting, they call it the Auto Max. They're like a C-clamp, they function like a C-clamp, but I've got it clamping this big thick piece down now, and I can just quick pop that off, and then we'll take this little bitty guy and quick pop that on. And without adjusting anything, it can clamp just as tight on this as it can on this. So very cool stuff. Go check out all the links down below to all this kind of stuff. I did also want to address the idea of dust collection in this thing. Now, because these holes go all the way through, I know that dust is going to get in here. I maybe talked about it. I don't remember the edit at this point. But I don't know how fast and how bad it's going to get, so I'm just going to deal with it when I come to it, knowing that I kind of have a plan, which is going to be putting a dust collection fitting on the side over here so I can hook my long dust collection hose up to it, and then I can put a sheet of plywood or something on top to seal off all of these holes. And it's drafty enough in there, it's not going to be completely sealed, but it will have really good suction. And then what I'll do is either open one hole or maybe I'll have a hole in the side here, but I'm going to use my air compressor to blow it in there and agitate the settled dust. And when that becomes airborne, I think the dust collector is just going to rip it right out of there and make it really clean. I can probably do all that without even taking the tools out of their storage space. So the other thing I wanted to point out was this great big compartment. It's maybe deeper than it needed to be for the dog holes, but that was also by design. A lot of times when I'm working on a project here, I might have something come up that's more urgent, and I don't have a place to put the parts and pieces from the project I'm currently working on because I don't have that much flat open storage space. So this is a big enough compartment that I could actually put a full flat packed cabinet inside here out of the way, work on something else, then come back and get it back in here. So this space does kind of double and triple duty depending on what I need it to do. But anyway, guys, that's enough rambling. That is it. That's the project. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you go check out the links below. Go support Craig. Great company. I've actually been down to their main headquarters. It's really close to where I live. I actually have a quick video of the tour that I took down there. I can leave a link to that too. But all right, I'm out of things to say. Thank you guys for watching. It's hot. We'll see you next time.